Hi, it's Owen here. Welcome to another Slumber story. This time I've reached right back in time and found two old annuals that children would have enjoyed back in the 1950s. One is the Lone Ranger and the second is the John Wayne Annual. There is a story from each. Just relax. Just close your eyes. Just let your mind drift away, listening to the story. Nosta. Taken from the Lone Ranger Annual, 1961. The Man Called Rabbit. Rabbit Keene, newly hired sheriff of Broken Bow, stepped out of his office and into the blazing sun of the main street. As he came outdoors, the eyes of a dozen bystanders were upon him. Rabbit seemed unaware of them as he climbed into his saddle, but behind him he could hear the sneering remarks. "See, I told you the new lawman would back away from a showdown. Don't blame him myself. Wouldn't want to face that rustler Tip Malloy and his gang if I was sheriff right now, especially with Tip's brother Pete locked up in the caboose." "Well," remarked an aproned storekeeper, "he won't be in the caboose for long. All Pete Malloy has to do is wait until his brother rides in to free him. There won't be any sheriff around to stop him. Look at him go. No wonder they call him Rabbit. Never seen anyone run so fast or scared in my life." There was only one dissenting voice in the crowd, a raw-boned stranger who had just ridden in. "You boys have the sheriff figured all wrong. They call him Rabbit all right, but not because he's scared." More than that, the stranger did not say. An hour later, Tip Malloy and his band of rustlers thundered into town. "Where's the sheriff?" roared the hulking Tip Malloy. "I'm ready for a showdown if he is." "Sorry," said a bystander. "The sheriff scampered out of town when he heard you were coming." Tip bellowed his laughter. "Scared stiff, eh? Well, come on, boys. Let's get my brother out of that cell." As they crowded into the jail, there was another roar of laughter from Tip. "Look, that sheriff was so scared, he even left the keys here for us. Ha ha ha! Reckon that scared Rabbit is plumb sorry he ever tangled with a Malloy gang," said young Pete from his cell, as his brother turned the key in the lock. "We'll skin him alive when we get him," laughed Tip. "Just like we do any jackrabbit." "All right, Malloy, here's your chance to skin if you can." At the sound of that voice, Tip whirled. There in the doorway stood the sheriff. Behind him, Tip could see the excited faces of the citizens of Broken Bow. With an oath, Tip went for his gun, but even before he cleared the leather, The sheriff's colt had spoken its piece, and Tip's gun hand was out of commission. The gang had never seen a draw as fast as that. They cowered in submission as Keane covered them. "All right, boys," said the sheriff. "You've got the door open. Reckon you can all get into that cell with Pete." And they did. Afterwards, when it was all over, Rabbit Keane stepped into the street once more. But this time he was followed by admiring glances. "It was all a plan," said the storekeeper. "He tricked them into that jailhouse, and every one of them was a wanted man. And did you see that draw? It was pure greased lightning." "That's what I was trying to tell you," said the stranger. "I knew Keane when he was sheriff of Cimarron. It was his fast thinking and fast draw that earned him the name of Rabbit." The Spook of Hoedown Hollow by Clinton Stewart. Taken from the 1955 John Wayne Annual. "Darn it," explained Pete Mould, the little deputy sheriff of Hoedown Hollow, nervously. "I used to say I didn't believe in spooks, but now I'm not so sure." His chief, Sheriff Miles High, grinned. "I never thought I'd hear you say that, Pete," he replied. "Personally, I'm much more concerned with the trouble real live people are likely to bring me than I am with any ghost." He tossed a paper down on his desk, and Pete glanced at it. It was a poster that had just been delivered from the printers. $1,000 reward for information leading to the capture of Jake Garrett, who escaped from Texas State Prison last Sunday. "What makes you think that Garrett will head this way?" Pete Mould asked. The sheriff shrugged. "When we arrested him, he threatened to get his revenge on us, didn't he? I reckon he'll come back here, just like he said he would, if he ever got free." Pete Mould shook his head slowly. "No," he replied. "I don't think you're right there, Chief. Garrett's been out of prison nearly a week already, and he hasn't showed up yet. In my opinion, that means he isn't coming. Besides, he knows well enough that if he turned up here, we'd recognize him and arrest him again. If you ask me, he'll turn round and go right the other way. Revenge or no revenge." "Maybe you're right," the sheriff grunted. He sat down at his desk and studied the poster more closely. No two other men in the world could have looked so different as Miles High and his little deputy, Pete Mould. He was short and fat, like an outsized football with legs, while the sheriff was thin and so tall that Pete swore he must have snow on his head all year round. "Yes," the sheriff said again, "maybe you're right." And the thick, ugly face of Jake Garrett scowled at them from the picture on the poster, sneering almost as though it was saying, "I know, Sheriff, but I'm not telling you." Outside the jail, the wind was violent. blowing around the wooden porch and whistling through the arcades that covered the sidewalk. It set up a mournful howling, like a banshee in a churchyard. Pete shivered. "Reminds me of that darn spook," he muttered. "Could be him running around outside now." For 2 nights in succession, the ghost had visited the jail and almost scared the wits out of the little deputy. The first night, he woke up to see a white face peering in through the window. As he looked at it, it had screwed up horribly, grimacing at him. He turned over in bed and shook the sheriff. But by the time Miles High had opened his eyes, the face had vanished. The next night, Pete had hardly been able to sleep. So it was that he woke up when a hand touched the window latch and tried to force it open. He saw more of the ghost this time, a tall figure, all white and shimmering, which turned and disappeared into the darkness when he sat up. Again, the sheriff had been too late to see it. "I don't believe there was a ghost," Miles scoffed. "You had too much cheese and pickles last night, and you dreamed the whole thing." Pete shook his head. "No, I didn't. That's one thing I'm plumb certain of." "Then how was it I didn't see the ghost?" "Because you took too long to wake up," groaned Pete. "I keep explaining it to you, Sheriff. It was a good 5 minutes before I could get you to open your eyes." By that time, the spook had gone. "Well, I'll wake earlier this time," the sheriff grinned. "In fact, maybe I won't go to sleep at all, if it'll help to reassure you that there's no ghost in this jail." He unfolded his lank form from the chair and stood up, towering over the little fat deputy, with his head almost touching the ceiling. "I'm just going down the road to stick this notice up outside the post office," he said, picking up the reward sheet with Jake Garrett's picture on it. "Meet me there in 10 minutes, and we'll go and have a chocolate sundae together. Maybe that will cheer you up." "All right," chuckled Pete, looking up at his tall chief. "And remember, if you wait for me by the telegraph pole again, keep your hat on this time, so I'll know which one is you." Pete Mould and Miles High went to bed early that night. Pete said he was tired after missing his beauty sleep on each of the 2 previous nights. And besides, now that Miles had promised to help him, he was anxious to prove to his chief that the ghost really existed. At least he was anxious while he was up, and it was daylight. But as soon as the pair of them crawled under the blankets of their big double bed, he started to feel differently about it. Lying there in the darkness, they were a strange sight. Pete was so fat that his stomach, pushed against the bedclothes, made them into a hump like a small tent, while the sheriff was so long that his feet and ankles stuck out of the blankets at the bottom of the bed. He pushed them through the brass rails and rested them on a chair. But though Miles turned quickly over in the bed and started breathing deeply, Pete couldn't sleep. Blinking nervously, he stared up at the ceiling for a very long time. After a while, he nudged the sheriff with his elbow, and Miles broke off breathing with a gurgle. What's the matter?" he asked sleepily. "How is it you don't believe in ghosts?" Pete said. Miles shook his head and came out of his doze. "I never said that," he retorted. "What I said was I didn't believe in this one. As a matter of fact, I saw a ghost once." You did?" "Yes. When I was a Texas Ranger back in Lordsburg. I said I didn't believe in ghosts, and somebody bet me $10 I wouldn't spend a night alone in a haunted house. Naturally, I couldn't pass up on an opportunity like that, so I took it on." "And did anything happen?" Pete stammered. "Not right then. I took my bedroll over to the house and laid it on the floor of the best bedroom, where the wicked old rancher was supposed to have died 10 years before. Every night, they said, he came out and walked up and down the room, looking for one of his ears that got cut off when he had a fight with an Indian and was killed." Yes, and then?" "Everything was quiet till about 1 o'clock in the morning. I was just beginning to tell myself I'd be right after all this, when there came a horrible moaning and groaning and a rattling of chains." "Yes." "And then a horrible tapping and clattering, like a skeleton that had taken his skin off and is dancing around in his bones." "And after that?" gasped Pete. "Then, just like they said, the ghastly form of the wicked old rancher came through the wall, just as if it wasn't there." Pete sat up, clutching the bedclothes about him. His eyes were bulging like glass marbles. "And what did you do?" he gulped. "I went right through the opposite wall the same way," chuckled the sheriff. He turned over and pulled the blankets up round his face again. Pete could feel the bed shaking as Miles laughed silently to himself. "Why, you, yelped Pete angrily. "You skunk! You've been pulling my leg all this time." But the sheriff had closed his eyes and started to snore again. Pete shook him, but Miles High refused to be wakened. And in the end, Pete gave up on the attempt. He lay back in bed and stared up at the ceiling once more. For a long time, nothing happened. Pete tried to sleep, but the story Miles had kept running in his head. He imagined the wicked old rancher looking for his ear, and skeletons dancing around in their bones, and the whole thing sent cold shivers of fear running through him. He felt much worse now than he had before Miles had told him the story. "I wonder what the time is," he muttered to himself, his voice sounding empty and hollow in the stillness of the room. "I bet it must be nearly 1 o'clock. He shuddered again. "Wonder if this spook walks at 1 o'clock, like the one in the sheriff's story," he murmured. Then he grinned feebly and tried to cheer himself up. "Oh, old Miles was just fooling me anyway. I don't reckon he meant what he said. Not one little bit." Outside, the church clock struck. Pete counted the harsh metallic notes. 12 o'clock, he gasped. He remembered that for spooks, midnight was just as bad as 1 o'clock in the morning. If anything was going to happen, he could expect it to start any minute now. Fearfully, He peered over the top of the sheets and stared into the darkness that pressed tight and cold around the bed. It was like looking into the depths of an inkwell. Only blackness stared back at him. And then Pete jerked. There was something white on the other side of the room, something shapeless he couldn't quite make out. He stared at it, and it seemed to change in form, growing taller and more narrow, and then shrinking down to a squat, square shape. Pete rubbed his eyes and blinked at it. Then he uttered a sigh of relief. It was only the washstand in the corner. His imagination had done the rest, turning it into a sort of ogre. He laughed feebly to himself and lay back on the pillows. "I guess Miles was right," he said. "There's no such thing as spooks. Maybe I did have too much cheese and pickles that night. It must have been a bad dream that kept me awake." He closed his eyes and his pudgy face relaxed in slumber. He breathed deeply once, twice, 3 times. Then a squawking, groaning noise cut through the darkness like a knife. Instantly, Pete jerked awake and sat bolt upright in the bed. What was that?" he asked aloud. Across the room the door was opening slowly, inch by inch. The little deputy stared at it. "Drat those rusty hinges," he gasped. "I've been meaning to get them oiled for weeks." For a minute he felt all right. Then he realized the cause of the noise. Then his face whitened, and he caught his breath as he realized that the door was still opening. A hand appeared at the edge of it, and then a head with a blank white face peering cautiously around the opening. "Miles! Miles!" yelped Pete, shaking furiously at the sheriff's shoulder. The sheriff blinked sleepily. "Eh?" he grunted. "What's that? What's the matter?" It's the ghost," stammered Pete. "It's here again." "Oh, go to sleep," grunted the sheriff. "I tell you there is no ghost in this jail." "But I saw it," gasped Pete. "It was right over there, all white and horrible and ugly. It was so awful it give me the jim-jams." "You've been looking at yourself in the mirror again," Miles told him. "No," panted Pete. "It's not that. It's... He looked up and stared across the far corner of the room. Then he pointed a trembling finger at what he saw. "Look," he gasped. "It's over by the washstand now." Miles High came upright in the bed, and he too saw the figure. "By Jiminy, you're right, Pete," he explained, and throwing back the blankets he jumped out of bed. Had he been shorter, the sheriff might have reached the washstand in time. As it was, his long legs got entangled in the brass rails of the bedstand, and it was several seconds before he could stand up on the floor. By that time, the ghost had turned and run out of the room. The sheriff struck a match and touched it to the wick of an oil lamp standing on the table beside his bed. The room was flooded with light, but it revealed only that the ghostly figure had gone. "You saw it this time, didn't you?" asked Pete. "Yes, I saw it," nodded the sheriff. "It was there all right." But his voice was thoughtful as he walked across the room to the washstand, and he didn't really appear to be taking much notice of what Pete was saying. "It was poking around down by the washstand," the little deputy said. "Do you think it had lost an ear like the ghost you told me about?" "I don't know," Miles answered slowly. "But it certainly didn't go out through the wall." He walked over to the door and inspected it. The door had been unlocked when they went to bed, and there was no sign of any force having been used on it. Apparently the ghost had just turned the knob and walked in. He went back to the washstand. Stooping down, Miles tried the drawer. It was locked. "Yes," he mused. "I locked that drawer the night we arrested Jake Garrett. It hasn't been opened since." "Do you think the ghost will come back, Chief?" Pete asked. "I'm sure it will," Miles told him, "but not tonight. And when it does return, we're going to be ready for it." He went back to bed, and reluctantly Pete followed him. The sheriff spent the night in peaceful slumber. But Pete could only doze fitfully, and a dozen times he woke up and gazed over fearfully at the washstand in the corner. But as Miles had predicted, there was no further sign of the ghost, and presently the first rays of morning sunshine began to stream through the window. That day the sheriff was busy. First he found the key and opened up the drawer of the washstand. He peered inside, and what he found caused him evident satisfaction. For he locked the drawer again, and was humming to himself as he brushed the dust off his hands, went into the office, and read through some papers on his desk. Later he went down the road and made some purchases at the provision store, though he didn't tell Pete what he'd bought, and refused to discuss it with him. When he came back, he went into the bedroom again. Pete Mould crept over to the door and put his eye to the keyhole. He could see the sheriff's back to the door, and he knelt beside the washstand. But he couldn't see what Miles was doing. Then the sheriff stood up, and Pete had to hurry away from the door and pretend to start working again to avoid being caught spying. "I wonder what that hombre's up to," Pete muttered to himself. But he didn't find out. That night they went to bed at the usual time. Pete rolled himself up in the blankets on one side of his bed, and Miles carefully pushed his feet from under the bottom end of the bedclothes, through the brass rails, and rested them on a chair. But this time Pete had taken a few precautions of his own. When Miles wasn't looking, he sneaked a shotgun to bed with him, was hiding it under the blankets on his side. In a few minutes Miles was off to sleep and breathing evenly, with the reassuring feel of the shotgun beside him. Pete soon dozed off too. He dreamed of ghosts and skeletons and walking through walls. Part of the time Miles was chasing him through a haunted house that was echoing with screams and rattling chains, while bony hands reached out to clutch him. Then he woke up and he realized he was frightened. The room was in darkness, and down the end of the bed, something small and white seemed to be staring at him. "Look out," he yelled loudly. "It's here, Miles. The spook." Grabbing up the shotgun, He flailed at the white shape. "Get off!" shouted the sheriff. He jumped out of bed and started hopping around on one foot, clutching the other. "That was my big toe, you idiot. What you saw was my toenail shining in the darkness." "Sorry, Sheriff," mumbled the deputy, climbing back into bed rather shamefacedly. I get too excited." They settled down again and went on waiting. The church clock struck 11, then 12. In the room, it just got darker and darker. And then, just as on the previous night, the door opened and started to creak open. Pete sat up in bed and shook the sheriff vigorously. He pointed at the door, and his mouth worked, but he was so frightened he couldn't say anything. Miles woke and put up a hand to caution him to silence. Lying back, they peered over the top of the bedclothes and watched what the ghost would do. Cautiously, the ghost came into the room and peered around, as though afraid that someone might be waiting to spring on it. Then it crept over the washstand and bent down. Its hand rattled on the knob of the drawer, and it drew the drawer open noisily. Reaching inside, it fumbled about, and then, "Ouch! Ouch! Ugh!" it yelled. Springing up, it began to do something that resembled a Highland fling, at the same time waving its arms about vigorously. In a flash, Miles had sprung out of bed and was running across the room, his bare feet making a loud plip-plop on the floor. Hurling himself on the back of the white figure, he brought it down. "The light, Pete," he shouted. "The light." Pete fumbled for the matches, and his teeth were chattering. He dropped 3 or 4 matches on the floor. Then he managed to strike one and lit the lamp with it. The flame grew high, and by its light, Pete saw the sheriff struggling with a figure in white. The little deputy sprang to the rescue, and soon between them they had the ghost helpless. Then Pete saw what he'd taken for a ghost was really a man in a long white cloak with a hood over his head. Through 2 holes cut in a pillowcase, the man's eyes glittered evilly. "Let's see who it is," the Pete suggested. And while Pete held the spook's hands, Miles pulled the hood back over its head. The man jerked his head away, and the ugly, scowling features of Jake Garrett were revealed. "Well, here's your ghost, Pete," Miles said. "Jake Garrett," Pete gasped. "And here's how we caught him," the sheriff went on. He lifted Garrett's arms to show a mousetrap clamped on each of his fingers. "I got those mousetraps down at the provision store," the sheriff explained, "and I put them in the drawer on top of the things that were in it. When Garrett shoved his hands inside, he put them right into the mousetraps. I guess you could say we got him trapped." laughed Pete. "That's a good one. You've said it, Sheriff. Jake Garrett is trapped right enough." When the outlaw was safely locked in a cell, Miles High explained. "Remember that time when we arrested Jake Garrett?" he asked. Garrett was carrying a briefcase. We put him in a cell, just as we have now, and without thinking I tossed his briefcase in the drawer of that washstand. I locked the drawer and forgot all about it. In fact, I never gave it another thought until last night, when the spook went over to the washstand," said Pete. "That's right. Ghosts don't normally bother about such things as washstands. So I opened up the drawer to see what it might be after. I found Garrett's briefcase and all the money he had been hoping to get away with when we arrested him. And I realized that when he escaped from prison, he came right back here to get it." "He knew we'd recognize him if we saw him," the sheriff continued. "So he hit on this plan of disguising himself, dressing up as a ghost. He thought he'd put us off long enough for him to get the money and clear out. It's been him, of course. It's been him that's been troubling us for the last 3 or 4 days. Well, I'll be darned," was all Pete Mould could think of to say. The end.